Yes.
Nope. All right, everybody's got a handout. Jim, can you hear me through the Zoom? Jim, can you hear me? Just give me a thumbs up. I've muted you.
I can now.
Okay. All right. I know Nancy's here. Father Lester's coming. We're gonna get started because we've got a lot to get through. I haven't heard from her. I don't have any reason to think she's not going to be here. All right. This week we're talking about faith, little tiny part of all of our lives, maybe not so tiny for some. And I called it, he took the form of a grunt. This is from one of the letters of Saul, I believe, I cannot remember now, but the line goes, though taking the form of God, Jesus, or being in the form of God, he took the form of a slave, doulos. And in other places and essays, I've said that grunts are the lowest on the totem pole in the military. And throughout all of this presentation or Bible study, I've drawn these parallels, and they're going to be even more coming to sharper focus today. But there's a lot of parallels between military service and ministry and what Jesus does. And so I always I alter that line to say that Jesus took the form of a grunt, because that's the kind of soldier that Jesus is. And then I'll talk about how the divine warrior and the motif that we'll read about makes Jesus and all of us a kind of hyper priest or hyper priests or hyper priesthood. So over the course of the study, I've suggested that if Yahweh is a man of war, then his son is a military brat, making Mary a military spouse. And Joseph, he's adopted, his name, and Jesus' father makes no appearance in Paul's letters, in Mark's gospel. It doesn't appear until Matthew and Luke. So he's kind of like glommed on, and he is the story's way of making Jesus a king, a fulfillment of the Davidic promise. But he's not Jesus' father, he's his adoptive father. I've also pointed out that the Son of God inherits the family business, just like he inherits the name of his vocational forebears, the sons of Nun and Jehozadak. So I hope by now it's clear that the question of faith and service is not whether Jesus was a soldier or not, but what kind of a soldier: officer or enlisted, grunt or pogue, combatant or non-combatant. And a pogue is a person other than grunt. Anybody who's not a frontline soldier, in the army at least, is called a pogue. It can be a derogatory term. It usually is. It doesn't have to be. Jesus' service is tied up in a faith that he embodies, which brings us to the name that the Gospel of Mark gives to the village of his youth. And remember, names have meaning in the Bible. Anytime you see a name, it's probably worth it to Google it, and Wikipedia is going to give you the etymology of a name. And that's place names, people names. Barak of Judges and Jesus are both military leaders whose hometowns are holy cities. For Barak, whose name means flashy, glittery, it also can be translated as lightning, and whose dad, Abinoam, the father of beauty, making Barak beauty. For Barak, this was Kadesh or Kodesh, Naphtali, the holy city, literally translates as holy. It's also the Levitical city of refuge in the ancestral tribal allotment of Naphtali. According to Mark, Jesus came out of Nazareth, Galil, a village whose name derives from Nazar, the Hebrew root verb we talked about last session that means to consecrate. And Nazara is well, I'll get into it, but it's technically Greek, and then Galil, who remembers what Galil means? From Isaiah 9. Galil Hagoyim is the blank of the nations. It means district. It's like a circle, but when it's referring to places, it's a town, a district, region of the Gentiles. And that was referring to Lower Galilee, Upper Galilee, which includes the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali. Associating, and this is most of the next couple of slides are my hypothesis as to why Nazareth is important and what it has to do with our faith. But I haven't found this in like scholarly articles. There's a big debate about what the Nazarites were, whether the name of the town of his hometown matters. I think it does matter. I think it is connected, and I'll tell you why. Associating Jesus' hometown with Nazar suggests that his closest friends and followers saw in him a gritty, populist holiness in sharp contrast to the ornate, priestly pretense of Jerusalem. And notice Barak, lightning, flashy, glittering, son of beauty, and then Nazar, which we associate with the Nazarites. Like Jesus, in scare quotes, his name is what? What's Jesus' real name? Native, in his native tongue. Joshua, or that's the English name. They probably called him Yeshu, right? For short for Yehoshua or Yeshua. Like Jesus, the word Nazarite follows an illogical and borderline misleading path from its origins. Hebrew verbs become nouns through vowels. Last week I mentioned that Nazar, to consecrate, becomes Nazir, a person consecrated, like our friend Samson. English descends from Greek, however, which uses suffixes to make verbs into nouns. The usual person-forming suffix is ites. You think of Israelites, Canaanites, Midianites. This is Greek writers glomming ites onto the end of Hebrew words. Yisrael plus the Greek ites, Israelites, Israelites. But Nazarites never appears in the Bible. Old Testament, Greek, Hebrew never appears. It's not a word that exists for the Bible. Whichever of the 70 rabbis translated the book of Numbers rendered Nazir into Greek as eukomai, a verb meaning to pray. Therefore, when someone took a vow to Nazar, remember Nazar is a verb, they became prayers. They became a verb instead of a noun. And you can think of it as prayers, those who do pray, those who do the thing that we call praying. For a parallel, everybody's heard of the Essenes, right? And they produced the Qumran scrolls. They refer to themselves as Asa HaTorah, the doers of Torah. See how making a verb out of a noun gives you kind of credit for being the thing that you're supposed to be doing. That's because biblical holiness is not a noun that you can buy and sell, like capital C Christian music or Christian books. Faith is an adjective that you have to earn, not a haughty title, but a humble question. Have I acted little c Christian today? The rabbis who translated Judges held to more conventional methods for bringing Hebrew concepts into the Greek language. Every application of Nazir in Judges to Samson is Nazareon, a noun. The same word as an adjective is Nazareos, the name by which the earliest followers of Jesus referred to themselves. In Matthew, the author or the community that authored Matthew is so convinced that there's a connection between the most famous Nazarite and Jesus, this backwoods-born Messiah, that he claims it's all a prophecy. And if you look into the scholarly literature, nobody knows what prophecy Matthew's referring to. And yet look at Judges 13, 5, 7. And then again, when Samson refers to himself, he says, I have been a Nazaraean from birth, from my mother's womb. What was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazaraean. And that is straight out of Judges 13. Nazareth is not just a reference to a place of Nazareth. When Mark, in the first chapter, verse 9, talks about Jesus of Nazareth, until Jesus is baptized, he is described as Apo Nazara, out of Nazareth or of Nazareth. But to be of Nazareth biblically is also a reference to a consecrated people who self-identified with the poor people's piety of Numbers 6. It's not only in Matthew 2 it appears. I was getting ready to do a whole worksheet on the name Nazareos and Christianos. Christianos, just like Nazareos, is this Greek Christos plus this Latin suffix, Ionos, and it means to be owned by the thing that you're being attached to. So the people of Antioch, which is the capital of the Syrian province of Rome, they came up with this nickname, and they called them Christians in Acts 12 or 5. I can't remember what it was. And then, oh no, it's in one of the Gospels. And then when Herod Antipas is questioning Jesus, no, it isn't Antipas. I think it's one of the Roman officials with Paul. He says, "Oh, are you going to make me a Christianos? Are you going to make me a slave of this Messiah as well?" It's a derogatory term. Nazareon never was. Initially it never was. It was just to be of this thing that sounds a whole lot like Nazar, this poor people's piety. To understand why and how Nazar served as a populist contrast to priestly Kodesh, we need to take a closer look at the Nazaritic vows and what they represented to everyday Israelites. If you felt like giving these vows a shot, what you did is you declared your intent publicly, and you outlined approximately when you thought you'd be done. The timeline wasn't a hard and fast, but once you did it, you declared it publicly, and you then began observing the 3 basic rules: no grapes, no haircuts, no corpses. And I mean, it was strict. You can't eat the seeds or the skin of grapes. You can't drink vinegar, wine, or fruit juice from grapes. Real strict. You can't let a razor touch your head at all. It's supposed to let your hair grow as long as possible. And you never touch a corpse. If you messed up, you shaved your head and you started over. The clock reset. When you're done, you went to the tabernacle. This was in Numbers 6, before the temple ever was constructed. You went to the tent of meeting, correct? And you had a priest prepare burnt offerings. And this is when it gets real good. Once the fire was lit, you shaved your head, tossed your hair into the fire underneath the burning lamb and ram, and then you ate it with the priest. Yeah, it's disgusting. But maybe it's supposed to be. I don't know. And then you could drink. Every biblical instance of Nazir is complicated. Samson's vows were involuntary. His mother, Hannah, made them on his behalf in order to get a child. Neither did Samuel take his own vows. His mother, Hannah, did the exact same thing as Samson's mother, unnamed mother. And then Hannah said she lent her child to the Lord, and he became a judge of Israel, and he was a Nazarite from birth. Whether or not, and we know Samson touched corpses. He went to parties. It doesn't say explicitly that he drank, but he definitely had a good time. He touched corpses, either a lion corpse or the corpse of the people that he killed with a jawbone. Samuel led some Israelites in battle. I don't know if he ever drank any. We have no, there's nothing in the text that suggests he ever cut his hair. Elijah is another person who may have been a Nazarite, but that's based mostly off of him being the inspiration behind John the Baptist. John the Baptist he and Elijah both wore a garment of hair with a belt of leather around their waist, almost verbatim. And John drank no strong drink and, quote, came with the spirit and power of Elijah, end quote. Several times in Luke and Matthew, it's explicit that John is like the next Elijah. And so if you hear that Elijah may have been a Nazarite, it's because we think that maybe John was. Then Jesus's brother James, also known as Yaakov, James the Just, was the first bishop of Jerusalem, who, according to the 2nd century Christian historian Hegesippus, was, quote, holy from his mother's womb. He drank no wine or other intoxicating liquor. No razor came upon his head, end quote. No reference to Nazarite. It's this weird, like, tongue-in-cheek thing. Finally, we have, there's Yaakov, and we have Saul, who at Sentre had his hair cut, for he was under a euche, a vow, which is what the Greek Septuagint says in number 6. When you take the euche of a euchomai, the vow of a Nazarite, then you do all these things. Euche is, again, another weird tongue-in-cheek thing for vows, for Nazaritic activity. And so he's under a vow. He shaves his head at Sentre in Acts 18. Later, under the advice of James the Just, this is when he's beginning to get accusations of not being a Jew or violating Torah. James says, hey, we have these euchomai, and they're going to go to the temple and shave. Why don't you pay for their shaving their heads, and you do it too, so that everybody knows you're still under Torah. And he does. This is in Acts 21, I believe. Yeah, Acts 21, 23 through 26. So to be of Nazara is to be of the Messiah, to be about the same things that he was about. But Jesus was not a Nazarite. He drank wine and he touched corpses. In fact, the corpses he touched came back to life. Lazarus and one other person, I can't remember the other one. But most Nazarites we know of also played fast and loose with the vows. To be like Christ is to be Nazar-ish, which is to say, narratively proximate to the movement started by this poor populist Messiah. After all, if Hebrews 4 is right, and Jesus is supposed to be our high priest, he didn't completely fulfill all that priests did either, like sacrificing at the temple or presiding over liturgical events. But faith is not about the letter of the law, it's about the spirit, and also the spirit of the law. What made Nazar unique was its universal access. Any child of Israel could take vows, men and women alike, regardless of ancestry. Service in the priesthood, however, was exceedingly androcentric and patrilineal. To become a priest, you had to be a male descendant of one of 4 houses of the tribe of Levi. Not all Levites were priests, but you had to be a Levite in order to be a priest, one of these 4 houses. And each house was assigned a specific area of operations on the temple grounds or the tabernacle grounds. You may remember these houses from the order of march that we covered 2 sessions ago from Numbers 2. The Aaronites inherited the high priesthood and were the only ones who could enter the Holy of Holies, meaning Passover and Yom Kippur were theirs to perform. Whoopsies. Oh, why is that doing that? The Kohathites could enter the sanctuary to maintain the holy elements, not the Holy of Holies, but the inner sanctuary. And the Merarites could tend the structure itself, but the Gershonites were relegated to the outer courtyard. Each priestly house was assigned to cities of refuge scattered throughout the tribal allotments of Israel, according to the book of Joshua. And guess which houses lived in Zebulun and Naphtali? Which do you think were living in the place that was brought into contempt? Yeah, probably the bottom 2. The Gershonites were given, lived in, Gershonites were assigned Naphtali, including Kadesh. The Merarites were assigned to Zebulun. And each of them, remember Zebulun, or I'm sorry, the Gershonites and Kohathites, they, at the rear of the formation, were the tribes of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Benjamin. That's because the humble are raised up and the haughty are brought low, as in Mary's Magnificat. Because the Bible depicts a constant battle against corrupted human impulses, like primogeniture, the law of the firstborn, that the first male received everything, as well as androcentrism. The Bible knows these struggles that we have created for ourselves, and it's a constant battle to undo these. The youngest is always brought forward. David, Abel over Cain, Jacob over Esau. Joseph over all his 11 brothers. Almost every time, the youngest, the least, the lowest takes a spot at the front. The Merarites, the Gershonites, who were assigned in the land brought in contempt, were also relegated to the outer courtyard and the framework. They didn't get the cool kid assignments. It's a pattern. So priests, called Kohen in Hebrew, had their own rules to follow, but they paled in comparison to the Nazarites. So it may be hard to see. I've split this into the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, then regular priests, and then the Nazir, the Nazarites. And you'll notice the language seems significant. The Kohen Gadol, just like the Kohen, they are to be Kadosh Elohim, holy to God, Leviticus 21. Did anybody read Leviticus 21? When I sent that out? It reads like a country club blacklist. Like, these are the people that priests are not allowed to associate with. Nobody without a blemish, nobody with this and that. Nobody can take a prostitute or a once married woman as a wife. Like, it's kind of messed up. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So all the Kohen were holy to God. The Kohen Gadol, we'll talk about what they wear, but they were given a turban, a hat, and on that hat was a crown. It's called a nezer, which is derived from Nazar. And on the nezer is engraved Kodesh LaYehovah, holy to God. In Numbers 6:8, the Nazir, the person themselves are to be Kadosh LaYehovah. Now, when it says priest, it's like, as priest, you are Kadosh LaYehovah. But as Nazir, you, the person, you have become this verb, right? And you become holy to God, not the crown that you wear, not the function that you serve, but you yourself have become holy to God. To be the Kohen Gadol, you had to be within the Aaronic house of the Zadokites. It's another thing, and within the Levitical tribal affiliation. To be what? Yes and no, because it says Aaron and his sons forever. When we get to the attire, Aaron was the one who was the high priest and Moses' brother, but it's the high priest. The attire is inherited. And we'll actually talk about the very end, all the way down to the time of Jesus. They still had, I don't know if they had the Urim and Thummim, but they had the priestly vestments, and that was only for the high priest. The priests would wear white with multicolored belt and maybe a band around headgear of some kind. Yeah. I found it interesting. And there's a reason for it. Yeah. And I'll talk about this, and if it's not clear already, I think maybe it will be. The priest was intended, I think, to be the political head honcho. So if we think of kings, presidents, prime ministers, that was the priest. In the Hasmonean dynasty, with the Maccabees, they did that. The king, the Basileus, was the person who did the stuff on Yom Kippur, dressed up. He burnt the sacrifices in front of everybody. Like, for 70 some odd years, they had that pretty close to their own ideal of what a nation state looked like in the biblical imagination. It was corrupted, and many of them, I can't remember. I have to look at my timeline. They may have still been Aaronic Zadokite. There's some trouble before Jesus gets into the picture. They've become political appointees, and there's three families, Boethius, and I can't remember the names, but there's three families who basically have a stranglehold on the high priesthood, and it's purely political. And so that in my mind is part of the reason why Jesus fulfills the function of the high priest without being touched by that corruption of being high priest. And they have the priests have rules similar to the Nazarites. You cannot drink strong drink on duty, whether you're a high priest or priest. And compared to the Nazarite, nothing at all ever. You can't even eat the grapes or the seeds or the skins. The Kohen Gadol had to trim their hair, and they couldn't let it hang loose. All the rest of the Kohens could have no bald patches or shave, and they could not shave the edges of their beards. And again, with the Nazarites, no razor may touch their beard at all. Finally, in terms of death or contact with corpses, the high priest could not touch them even for his father or his mother, which seems pretty strict. Priests could not do it except for their closest relatives, brother, sister, son, daughter, mother, father, maybe. The Nazarite is the same as for the high priest, not even for his father or his mother, but then it adds or for brother or sister. So it may not mean much because the high priest can only, or not for his mother or father, which seems like as high as he can go, but there's like this little extra kick. Mother and father for the Nazarite as well, but not even brother or sister. So the case I'm making essentially is the Nazarites were a kind of hyper priest. And this is the faith, the model of faith that seems to most closely resemble what I think of as Jesus in his own context. The piety of the Nazarites was democratic and therefore slightly independent, if not completely independent, from the corruption of the Levitical priesthood. That often the corruption that accompanied the resources and prestige associated with the temple economy. Rather than a more lenient piety, Nazir were held to an exceptionally rigorous standard, a kind of hyper priest, but without the classist baggage of the high priesthood. The first Kohen of the Bible is Melchizedek, whose name means King of Righteousness. Have we talked about Melchizedek? Okay, it's another class. I was building a class on war, and Melchizedek is fascinating to me. Melchizedek was also Melech of Shalem, King of Shalem, which is a form or it's cognate with Shalom, meaning peace. And most scholars agree that it's a reference to Jerusalem before it was Jerusalem, before the Israelites added the theonym Jah. I can't remember what Ur means, but essentially Jerusalem and Shalem were the same place. So he is the priest and king of the area that will become Jerusalem. And he was the Kohen of the God Most High, El Elyon. And this is the exact same God, highest God that fathered Jesus. In Greek, in the Greek Septuagint, he was the Kohen of the Hypsistos Theos, the highest God. And that is the exact same name that the demoniac, the possessed person who calls himself Legion, that's the same name that he gives Jesus. You are the son of Hypsistos Theos. It seems like this is his cosmological name. Before the Israelites, occupied and inhabited Jerusalem, it was the highest God, the highest of all these gods. And then Jesus comes along. That's the name that the angels and the demons know him by. And he begs Jesus not to torment him. There are two things that stand out to me. First, the encounter implies that priests were to be something like kings in Israel's political imagination. And I mentioned this is what the Maccabees did. Second, it ties ministry to military service. So Melchizedek appears in the middle of the Battle of Siddim. The Battle of Siddim, really quickly in Genesis 14, it's the first place where war, milchama, appears in the entire Bible. And there's a bunch of kings who have rebelled against their higher kings. The kings of the plain are like the vassals, and then the kings of Mesopotamia are their overlords. And they've decided to rebel. They're going to stop paying taxes, and they're about to get crushed. And Lot is a resident of one of the lands of the lower kings. And so Lot gets carried off as a possession. Abram hears about this, and he sends a group of 318 Hanik, which is equipped men. And they go and they lead a night raid, they rescue Lot, and they rescue everybody from the lower kings. They redistribute all the possessions, which is people as well as property. And that's when Melchizedek comes in. He says, "Oh, blessed are you by God Most High, the possessor of this and that and the other thing," after he's given back these possessions back to the lower kings. And he gives a tithe. Either Abram gives a tithe to Melchizedek, or Melchizedek gives a tithe to Abram. The language is unclear. And then we go back to the Battle of Siddim and how everything got sorted out afterwards. Right in the middle is where Kohen first appears. And so the parallel between ministry and military is unavoidable in the Old Testament. The ordination of priests, do you know where it occurs, Father Lester? In Exodus 32? Yep. You want to say more? So just after the golden calf incident is where the ordination of priests occurs. As they're descending Mount Sinai with the tablets of law inscribed by God's own hand, the first copy, Joshua, mentions to Moses that he hears a noise of war in the camp. Not a war against flesh and blood, but a spiritual rebellion against Yahweh. The sons of Levi rally to the Lord's side around a raging Moses who wants to just, first, God already knows what's happening. I'm going to wipe him off the face of the earth. And Moses is like, no, don't do that. You're a cool guy. Don't do that. And he comes down and he sees it. Now Moses wants to wipe them off the face of the earth. But God has already been convinced. And so Moses, in the midst of the revelry with the golden calf, and Aaron's like doing the Charlie Brown walk, he says, whoever's on the Lord's side, come to me. And he commands them to take swords and go throughout the camp and kill anyone who gets in their way. 3,000 Israelites died on that day. And in return for their blind, violent obedience, the Levites are forever rewarded with a priesthood for Israel. That day they were ordained for service of the Lord. That is the birth of the clergy in the biblical imagination, not without its own complexities, right? So what did normal priests do? Their primary responsibility was to perform all tabernacle and temple rites. Leviticus and Numbers describe in exacting detail the karban, or sacrificial animals, that priests slaughtered as offerings to God on behalf of the people. The root consonants of this word are karab, a verb meaning to bring close. Levitical priests, therefore, are the ones tasked with bringing the people near to God through the sacrificial system. On Passover, this Hebrew word pesach means to pave over. It's literally the tar and the bitumen that you lay on a road. It's like making even the road between us and God. When John comes as the forerunner, he says, and he's quoting, I want to say Isaiah, make straight the way of the Lord. It's evoking these kinds of ideas. Make it easier to get to and from God and us. That's Jesus' purpose. That's also the purpose of the sacrificial system. Priesthood is a hereditary responsibility, and every priest is anointed into their service when they come of age at 20. Remember, the age for service, military service, priestly service is 20. So everyone under 19 hasn't come of age. The Aaronite high priest, the Kohen Gadol, was the only one allowed to enter the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, the most important sacrificial feast day in Israel's liturgical year. Something about Yom Kippur as well. Have you heard this expression in John, said by John the Baptist, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world? John, the evangelist, seems to have mixed up his metaphor. There is no lamb, as in baby sheep, that takes away the sins of the world. The sheep, or in Passover, they were told to get a sheep, and if you couldn't afford a sheep, get any baby herdling, a calf of anything. Ideally a sheep, but whatever you can afford. And they kill it, and if you don't have a horror show on the outside of your house, on the posts, you're going to get a horror show on the inside, right? That could be it should be a lamb, a baby sheep, doesn't have to be. Yom Kippur is when the sins are taken away every year. That is not a baby sheep, it's a baby goat. The difference between goats and sheep is in their diet. Sheep are herd animals because they all rely on human beings. They have a symbiotic relationship with human beings. They eat grass. They can't eat much of anything except grass and like some weeds, right? And they have to have their wool shorn at least every year, or they fall over and they can't move. They're symbiotic. That's why, follow them like sheep. That's why. Goats could eat anything. That means they're more independent. They're a little ornery. And there's two animals slaughtered on Yom Kippur. The first was the goat of God, right? Yeah. First, the goat of God is slaughtered in the outer courtyard where everybody can see. And usually, then the priest washes his hands, and that completes the ceremony. On Yom Kippur, after the goat is slaughtered, lays down dead, his blood is all over the high priest's hands. Then he goes into the Holy of Holies and does some stuff, and he comes out and he takes another goat, the lamb or the goat for Azazel. I'm not sure what Azazel means. Some people said, oh, it's an angel, or it's like some foreign deity. We're not sure. William Tyndale was the first to translate it as the scapegoat. You've heard it as the scapegoat. And what happens with that one is he places bloody hands on the head of the scapegoat, and then they let them go off in the wilderness. That is the sins of the people, the iniquities of the people going free, just gone. There's a later tradition, they tied a red yarn and they pushed it over a cliff, but that's rabbinical, that's not biblical. And so there's no baby sheep who takes away the sins of the world. It's a goat who does it. A curmudgeonly, ornery, head-butting goat that you have to watch out for because they might, pound you in the stomach or maybe the balls. I don't know. So the high priest, what sets him apart beside his socio-political responsibility as the head of the Israelites is that he's the only person who sees the Ark of the Covenant and does the fancy stuff there on Yom Kippur. But in every other way, he's just another priest. Sometimes he does some fancy stuff with the Urim and Thummim, but that was rare. Functionally, the thing that set apart for him was going to the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, laying some of the blood from the goat of God on the ark, the seat of the ark, I believe. But anyway, I wanted to point that out because the goat is the one who takes away the sins of the world. God, Jesus, is the goat, not just the greatest of all time. He's literally the Yom Kippur goat. What's weird, though, is that before the Torah tells us what the high priests do, it tells us what they wear. So this appears in Exodus 28. These are the beged, the garments that they shall make. There's a breastpiece, the hoshen, the ephod, right here with the 12 stones, the Urim and Thummim. The ephod and the Urim and Thummim are synonymous, not exactly the same. It's not entirely clear. And then you have the coat of checker work, which could be this, but also I'll get to it in a moment. There's so many different pieces. Sometimes they blend together, and I'll get to that later. Then there's the fringed tunic. You can see the fringe down here, and it's supposed to reach all the way down to his feet. The sash, you can't really see it. The turban, the misnepet, and all of these together shall make the holy garments for Aaron your brother and his sons to serve me as priests. And it's all in one verse, 28:4. And it gets repeated in Exodus 39, I think. It's like repeating mostly the same stuff. There's some variation, but this is what they're wearing. The breastpiece, the ephod, the coat, the fringed tunic, the turban, and then the sash.
Thank you for that. Exodus 32, because we can go and compare it to, for example, Leviticus 8 and the ordination there, because that involves the lamb,
Yeah, there's very fancy. Yeah.
So there's like three different tracks of ordination. Exodus 32 is pretty brutal. But it's just very interesting that Leviticus 8 offers this process of going to the tent, because we still need some of those elements when you get ordained today, which is oil, unleavened bread, which is the wafer. There's no bull and lamb and lambs.
Yeah.
But no, I agree. I was going to
Yeah.
And this almost three different tracks.
Yeah.
Of history of ordination.
And I'll get to an example with the armor of God later, but it really kind of comes out. There's several avenues going on at once in the Bible. Sometimes they're conflicting, sometimes they're companions. Like parts of the Bible don't want any intermarriage. Very, very clear. Other parts of the Bible are don't mistreat your slaves. And there's some people who are like, I don't want to intermarry, but I also won't mistreat my slave. And there's others who are like, I want to mistreat my slave. but I don't care about intermarriage. So this is a community, this is a document that reflects an entire community. If anybody tells you, if you see inerrant or inerrancy, turn around and run, because they don't know what the Bible is. I'm very sorry, I'm being very blunt, but like, I was looking through something with Laura, looking at possible ministry stuff, and one was like, we believe the Bible's inerrant. I'm like, you're not gonna like that. You're not gonna like it. The Bible is inerrant. We believe the statements of faith will be like, we believe the Bible's inerrant. That's a political statement. That's not a theological statement. Anyway, Hebrews 4. I wanted to point out the kutinet, the fringed tunic. That's the same word for the skins made for Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:21, as well as Joseph's kutinet of many colors in Genesis 37. So Hebrews 4:14 insists that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Now, I've made the case that Jesus and the community he called to himself embodied Nazar more than Kodesh. I've contrasted Nazir with Kohen. I don't see an oxymoron, no, I see a paradox. Jesus can be both, even if he did not fully substantiate either one of them. He wasn't really a Nazirite. He also wasn't really the high priest. Jesus being high priest is more about being God's representative on earth, which is the function of the high priest. He is a man of war who fights in our stead so that we might be saved from being bad. We might be saved from isolation through the sacrifice of himself. And I was thinking about putting something in here. As a vet, and Glenn, I'd love to hear your feedback. One of the things that I found meaningful was the idea that I might have to sacrifice my life for our way of life. It's the idea, for me, that idea of sacrifice resonated with me deeply. Not to say that I'm Jesus, but there is this strain of like, soldiers are America's sacrificial lambs. And if you get some familiarity with the sacrificial lambs, that is kind of the point, right? You dress them up, you scapegoat in Greek cultures, you dress them up for a day, you take a slave, or it's literally a thing. You take an ugly person and you make them pretty for a little while. And then they represent this sacrifice to appease the gods, right? Sometimes they actually killed the victim. Usually it was posturing. You feasted, you put on a fake crown, and then they kind of abused you, and then life went back to normal. But this, I don't know if you want to say anything about sacrifice and whether or not that resonated with you in terms of service, Glenn, or if you did not want to reflect. It's up to you.
And you go back where you're at, you have to be.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating question, because as a South African, I appreciate, as a South African, my experience was watching Marines stand at gates of land that belonged to South Africans but no longer did, because Anglo-American took over that, and so it was very complicated. As an 11-year-old, we trying to figure out, well, this is my country. Why are you, in a different country, standing here, telling me I can't go to that beach because the diamonds in there is value to you, but this is where I live. This is where I live. So it's wonderful, complicated, required.
Well, that's the same concept of being in South Korea. They felt that on their land, and we not letting them in land that we were standing on, that they couldn't go.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Protecting even us. And
So I guess my curiosity is how does the military, what's the difference between service for freedom and the interests of country?
Yeah.
without the activities. Is it possible we can explore it? Yes.
I was gonna say, one of the things in divinity school, when I got out as a conscientious objector. And I got to divinity school and I very much felt like a pacifist. And there was this panel there's this panel and on a piece or politics, I can't remember. And another vet stood up and said something to the effect of like, I didn't serve for me, I served for all of you. And it created this weird, I could see where a pacifist would hear that in a corrupting power kind of way. Like, you owe me because I did this thing. And I also got in a lot of trouble. Well, it is complicated. For the same reasons I said, like, I'm sure many Israelites were like, no, we're not going to marry with other people.
Yes, yes.
And we're going to abuse our slave. Like the Jubilee of Leviticus 25 was never happened. They were supposed to release their slaves every 7 years. They're supposed to send everybody back to their own tribal allotment every 49 years. Never happened. They're supposed to, but that is this human thing that.
Yes. I mean, the church, and again, fully aware that even the church, this is the church in itself, is deeply enmeshed in politics. You know, any president that gets elected, they get anointed. No, they get blessed. Go to the national review. The Episcopal bishop, right? And our claim to fame is five of the Declaration of Independence were Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah.
And so I mean, the church is not innocent of all of that. You know, black people couldn't be ordained. That whole wonderful history of dysfunction.
Yeah.
Well, I will say that
How do we
I
explain?
love to speak. So I went to the Citadel, military school, and so I was involved, and my friends that were in that is a constant struggle to this day. The internal struggle of that Marine standing there, looking at you, the 11-year-old, knowing that you can't go to and why. The internal struggle in him is, at least in my experience, is exactly that. And that's a very, very minute, very small example, right? Of that internal struggle. That is exactly what you're talking about of, am I doing this for my country or for the politicians? You know, in every act of war,
Yes.
it ultimately is a political situation, right? And so I believe that is an internal struggle in service, right?
Well, and that's why in LA, for example, the chaplain, the chaplain at Central Jail, it comes out on and I'm busy after the training. I'm doing my test here for other competence. But that's part of the reason I went to be a chaplain to police officers. Even though I was beaten during the process, like police my whole life, what is the way we feel together? It becomes my curiosity. Right? And we explore a little bit. It's function. Which I say to the friends, and that's kind of dealing with that. My next curiosity is, well, how do we deal with it as a community? Is that even possible? I don't know.
Yeah.
Don't get kicked out. It's then you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to answer that, but I will say one way in which that articulates that was the Israeli military, both when I went to Palestine in 2006 and right now, Netanyahu just earlier this week tried to, begin undoing the power of the judiciary in Israel. Israel has a not completely formed democracy. You can listen to some podcasts, but the shit hit the fan and things got kind of rolled back when the Minister of Defense said, look, if you keep going down this road, it's a national security concern, because reservists are saying, look, if you dissolve the judiciary or take away their power, the UN then has a little bit more foothold in coming in and saying, you don't have a coherent internal moral structure, judicial structure. And if I go down over like Lebanon, I'm going to get dragged before the Hague and get tried as a war criminal, because there's no I'll call it cover, but so it's the reservists who began speaking up, such that the Minister of Defense is like, you shouldn't do this. He gets fired, and then Netanyahu finally rolls it back. When I was there in 2006, it was the same thing. There were these refuseniks, and it was a little bit more. In Israel, military service is compulsory. Everybody has to do it. And that gives the military a certain power, so that like today, the reservists are like, we're not going to do it. Even active duty people are probably feeling similarly, but they are restricted. Everybody has to do like 5 years or 3 years, and then you're a reservist for another 10 or 15. So in a situation like that, you have a lot of power in the military. One of my concerns now is that the military doesn't have the same, not everybody has to serve. And so if you've served, you're probably buying what the military is selling, which is money, stability. Yeah. So like, I don't have the same power. If someone were to come to me and if I were to say, hey, I don't want to fight this war, they're like, why did you join up? And it's a valid concern, but it's also like, I did choose, but like, it was a complicated decision because I was poor. My parents split up and the house was foreclosed, and like, I wanted to pay for college, and the military did it. So our instinct to want to make categories and fit people in there neatly. Even the Bible, I think I think the Bible is trying to cut against that. The Bible, in my mind, and in my estimation, sees human fallibility and is trying to work against it. I think Jesus is doing that too. Yeah, Christian.
The Israeli Supreme Court consists of 15 jurists. They don't all sit down at the same time and listen to cases. The head jurist picks 3, which is really sketchy.
Yeah.
Because political motivation can allow them to pick 3 that are going to go against the deal. Basically, looking at the Israeli Supreme Court, they're more powerful than Israelis Congress.
Oh yeah.
So maybe, who knows, but maybe Netanyahu is trying to take away a little bit of that power and get them to be more cohesive and work with, pretty much make it like ours, where it's executive, judicial, and congressional.
Yeah.
Split it up, make it a balanced power. Because the crazy thing is, anybody can be in office. And there's so many, unlike the United States, where we have a 2-party system, they have a bunch of parties where these people that get elected in the highest power, in the highest office, only win by 15 or 16% of the population. So
yeah.
Always.
Yeah. It's a fascinating conversation, but we have so much more fun stuff to get to. Back to the high priest, who is the embodiment of the divine warrior and his armor, the first glimpse of which can be found in Isaiah 59. So we're going to transition to the divine warrior and how that plays out through. Divine warrior and armor of God are synonymous. They are distinct, but they're very similar. And the earliest iteration of the divine armor, or the armor of God, begins in Isaiah 59, verse 17. But I think it's important to look at one verse prior, when Yahweh, wondered that there was no one to intercede in injustice. Then his own arm brought him yasa, salvation. The function of the judges, that was what they were supposed to do. There's no judge. And his tzedakah, righteousness, upheld him. He put righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of Yeshua, which is salvation, on his head. He put on beged of Nacham, or garments of wrath for clothing, and wrapped himself in zeal as in a me'il. So you'll see beged and me'il make dual appearances. That the high priest's vestments, there's a certain amount of overlap with the armor of God, the divine warrior. Those are last, whoopsies. So, and you have, I emailed a handout of this. I'm going to go through each one individually, and then I'm going to compare, and we can have a conversation about how some of these iterations look. The armor of God, the divine warrior. So in Isaiah 59:17, as I said, there's 6 items that the high priest wears, and the divine warrior, according to Isaiah, lists 4. A breastplate of righteousness, a helmet of salvation, garments of vengeance, and a mantle or a cape of fury. Yeah. The Greek version combines mantle and garments together as vengeance, saying something like, he put on a tunic of vengeance and wrapped himself in it as an outer garment as well. And if you read it, it's going to sound differently, but it's combining these. So this is Isaiah's vision of the armor of God. Vestments, helmet, breastplate, cape, or scapular. So mine's blue. Oh, interesting. Okay. The image I pulled was just a Roman tunic. I think it might have been a broad stripe tribune. I can't remember, but yeah. That was unintentional. But and in the old, like even in some areas of the world now, you just wear this thing like this. Like that's what you wear day to day, because it's like everything. If it's hot, you like hike it up, right? It's very modular. The next list we find is in the apocryphal book of wisdom, or the Wisdom of Solomon, written in the 1st century BCE and included with the Greek Septuagint, not the Hebrew Bible. It was too late. You know, there's intertestamental almost. Chapter 5, verses 17 through 20 declare, the Lord will take his zeal as his whole armor, and he will arm all creation to repel his enemies. He will put on righteousness as a breastplate and wear impartial justice as a helmet. He will take holiness as an invincible shield and sharpen stern wrath for a sword. And creation will join with him to fight against his frenzied foes. Wisdom 5, verses 17 through 20.
Is that one of the books that then quote unquote Bible?
Yeah, it's in the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha means doubtful. That's God. Ruth. There's a number of them. I'm not very good. Yeah. Okay. There's 5 or 6 books. Yeah, the Protestant Bible doesn't typically, or Protestant Bibles don't usually take them. Yeah, there's like I cannot remember if they're in the Tanakh. I think they are in like other with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel. I think, but I'm not positive. But yes, that is an affirmative answer, I suppose. Oh, yeah. Then in the 1st century CE, the Apostle Saul adapts the same imagery in his letter to the Christians at Thessaloniki, encouraging them to be sober and put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. So what's happened? In just 100 years, the divine warrior has gone from vengeance, fury, and wrath, zeal, faith, hope, and love. Last, but certainly not least, we get the full treatment in the epistle to the Ephesians, probably written by a person or a group following in Saul's footsteps, but a lot of scholars don't think Ephesians was written by Saul himself. There's so much more there that I have to get rid of the header and footer to make room. But here, this is what it says. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God to stand firm. Stand therefore and fasten the belt of truth around your waist and put on the breastplate of righteousness. As shoes for your feet, put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. With all of these, take the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Maybe it's like a water shield, just like the flaming sword of Genesis with the cherub that was put on the east gate of Eden. Then take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And this is what armor of God is a newer thing. It used to be just divine warrior and this was what he wore. But that's the canon, the broadly accepted canon of the armor of God. So reading this motif closely, there are two items that appear in each account, the breastplate and the helmet. If we look at them in Greek using the Septuagint for Isaiah, we see a common thread with a few outliers. The breastplate, or thorax, is mostly righteousness, dikaiosine, and the helmet, parakephalia, is mostly soterios, salvation. And this is all Greek, remember. The differences help us see the unique interests of each composer. The authentic Saul of Thessalonians, for example, comes off as markedly softer in tone, departing from the breastplate of righteousness in favor of faith and love, or pistis and agape, very kumbaya. However, he uses a lighter editorial touch for the helmet, which he tempers with humility, the hope of salvation. Maybe you'll be saved, maybe you won't. Another thing to notice is wisdom's language for the helmet. Parakephalia means touching the head. Maybe it's a turban, maybe it's a helmet, maybe it's a hat. It's less militarized than korutha from chorus, a more direct way of naming a soldier's helmet. That's like the Spartan thing where you have the little thingy, that's a korutha. Krisis is also more direct, meaning judgment or damnation, than soterios. And krisis is an adjective suggesting, soterios is an adjective suggesting salvation rather than the modern idea of justice or fairness. By looking at these accounts side by side, we also see a distinct callback to Isaiah's earlier usage. Pseudo-Saul of Ephesians seems to be correcting the authentic Saul, returning to the prophetic tradition with its fire and brimstone. In Thessalonians, the divine warrior motif is qualified by a caution against wrath, or orge. This stands out because it seems like pseudo-Saul is reinserting an offensive weapon that wisdom called for, a sword sharpened by wrath. So in other words, authentic Saul, the real Saul, seems to not like the violence. He has a little bit of anxiety around it. But whoever wrote Ephesians seems to be a little less anxious about violence. He puts the sword back in there, but he qualifies it. He says, this is the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of the Lord, right? And then in Revelations, we have the sword coming out of his mouth. It's the Bible, right? Ephesians continues its usage of wisdom by twice including the whole armor, verses 10 and 17 in Ephesians 6. Panoplia, the whole armor, albeit with subtle differences that implies that pseudo-Saul is sympathetic to toning down the aggression associated with military force. Pseudo-Saul of Ephesians is in between wisdom and Isaiah and Thessalonians. Isaiah and wisdom are a little bit more aggro, for lack of a better word. Wisdom attributes to panoplia zeal or zelos. In Ephesians, that zeal belongs only to God, theos. Am I losing anybody? Not only does Ephesians bring us back to Isaiah, it also draws us into the priestly vestments, which serve as a kind of divine armor, making the priests a kind of Israelite pseudo-soldier. So let's return to Exodus 28 because there are a few more details that link priests and soldiers. Priests ministered barefoot. The laver in the courtyard was for washing hands and feet, according to Exodus 30, verses 19 and 21. This recalls God telling Moses from the burning bush, "Take your sandals off your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground." It also anticipates Joshua doing the same at Gilgal right before the Battle of Jericho in Joshua 5:15. The outer garment, coat or robe, depending on your translation, required special care and construction to keep it from tearing. According to Exodus 28, 31, and 32, it's supposed to be one woven piece with an opening in the middle, like this word Tara. And Tara only appears right here in Exodus 28, 32. It's difficult to translate, and Hebrew was lost for a long time. Some translators, especially in the medieval period, translated as Habergion. I don't know. It's some weird medieval word. It's basically like a fancy shirt. But others have translated as a corselet. And don't look up corselet. You'll get some lingerie, because that apparently is what it is. The former, the Habergion, I don't know, is a medieval name for chainmail coats worn by knights in battle. In translations that provide notes, you might see an indication that another way to read Torah is like a coat of mail, so that it may not tear. The bottom line is that the outer priestly garment was to be seamless and to remain untorn. John's writings bring us back to Jesus as high priest and divine warrior, and not just the book of Revelation. His gospel is the only one to claim that during his passion, Jesus' tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom in John 19:23. This recalls the priestly robe, which was supposed to be seamless like a coat of chainmail, so that it may not tear. In other words, John depicts Jesus going to his death dressed for battle as the divine warrior, wearing the armor of God. As he carries his cross before he's stripped of his clothes, he is dressed for battle. And then they divvy up his clothes later, and that's when we hear that the soldiers say, "We shouldn't tear it. It's really nice. We shouldn't tear it." That's John pulling out from the vestment saying, this is the high priest's garment. Exodus is careful to distinguish between the outer robe and the inner tunic, but many ancient writers were not. John seems to confuse the two, either by mistake or by design, but he's not the only one. For reference, here is Exodus 28:4 in both the Masoretic Hebrew text in brown and the Greek Septuagint of the Leningrad Codex in green. The Jewish historian and military veteran Josephus sees the tunic and the robe as interchangeable. The same thing, doesn't matter. Use whatever word, the same thing. Perhaps the same thing. In describing it to a Roman audience, he writes, "The high priest is adorned with all of these things, but over these he wears a blue chiton," in Greek, "reaching to the feet." And where is chiton? In the Septuagint, it's the inner coat, but Josephus, he calls it the outer garment. He wears over it a blue chiton. So this for Josephus is interchangeable, the white and the blue. And Martin, hospitality is not blue because the high priest. It's another whole thing entirely. Now this chiton, Josephus continues, was not composed of two pieces, nor was it sewed together upon the shoulders and the sides, but it was seamless and untorn. Araphos hyphantos. This is from the Antiquities of the Jews, book 3, chapter 7.4. Exodus is careful to point out that the outer article is the thing that is to be seamless and untorn, and the inner one is only required to be of fine linen. John's Gospel and Josephus's Antiquities were written around the same time, the early 90s CE, and they both seem to combine or confuse the two into one eerily similar way. John and Josephus each describe this tunic coat using the same exact Greek terms, araphos hyphantos, a seamless single article of clothing. Josephus may only have in mind the priestly vestments, but John is very likely to be describing Jesus' execution attire with the divine warrior in mind, who approaches Golgotha dressed in battle in something like a chain of mail to mock death and deprive it of its sting. But there's another final parallel, I shouldn't say final, the final one we'll talk about tonight, linking Jesus' messianic military traits with the role of the high priest. Josephus calls Antonia an acropolis or citadel for the archieros, the high priest, where the stole, the vestments for the high priest, were kept. Not a coincidence. Priests, Kohanim, were like Israelite service members, the highest of which was the Kohen Gadol. Jesus is the high priest because he is the divine warrior. Josephus also describes the process of retrieving the stole hagios, the holy vestments. They were kept under the seal of the high priest and of the treasurers of the temple, which treasurers, the day before a festival, went up to the Roman captain of the temple guards and viewed their own seal, received the vestments, and again, when the festival was over, they brought it to the same place and showed it to the captain of the temple guards, their seal, which corresponded with theirs, and reposited them there. In Antiquities, Josephus says the Acropolis was built by the kings of the Hasmonean race, who were also the high priests before Herod. They called it the Tower, in which were reposited the stole or vestments of the high priest, which the high priest only put on at the time when he was to offer sacrifice. These stole King Herod kept in that place in Antonia. That brings us back to when Jesus is tempted by Satan before beginning his ministry in the military district of Israel, where we began this Bible study. Josephus again conflates military and ministry elements, this time in architecture rather than fashion. He claims that the Jews called Antonia the Tower, Pyrgos, even though he describes it as having 4 pyrgoi, 4 towers. The tallest was a full 25 feet higher than the others, and the pinnacle or citadel of the entire holy city of Jerusalem. Reading this in light of Matthew and Luke, it sure seems like Satan has taken Jesus to Herod's Antonia fortress, the crowning achievement of Herod's new and improved temple complex. In Matthew and Luke, they call it the Patergion of the Hieron, the tower of the temple, the highest of which was at Fort Antonia. The proximity, I should say, so the military fortress was the vestry for the high priest. That's where the armor of God resided when it wasn't being used. The proximity of the military with ministry, of militant holiness, I could say, is there right from the very start. After Yahweh destroys the whole earth and spares Noah's family, God declares, I have set my keshet in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When the keshet is in the clouds, I will see it, and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. What is this thing that is in the sky that symbolizes the Noahic covenant? Before this so-called rainbow symbolized anything, before it was a cutesy design parents painted on their kids' walls, it was an archer's bow. God's promise to not destroy by flood is a paradoxical reference to a weapon of war, which God points at God's self, foreshadowing God's readiness to suffer violence rather than inflict it, even death on a Roman cross, at the demand of his own community of faith. Jesus is the ultimate high priest, but he is also the divine warrior, ready to wage battle against our own sinfulness. Saintly soldierliness is integral to Christian faith. We passed over anointment, but it's important to point out that every priest, high and low, was anointed when they came of age and began their Levitical service. As a few kings were, but most were the exception rather than the rule. Like the leather-clad shields that ancient Israelite foot soldiers anointed with oil to keep supple for war, Israel's anointed ones were weapons in the war against worldly sinfulness. Belts, too, if they were to last, had to be anointed with oil. Let's keep going. Further back in Isaiah, where the divine warrior motif truly originates. Oh, yeah, it made a slide, so we'll go through that. Why is it not showing me anything? So I think I included this slide in the handouts. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a list of all the different things and what they stood for. When we put away the binary partisanship of either or, we will begin to be able to appreciate the full witness of Scripture as it concerns soldiers. We can stop cherry picking the Bible to ignore, minimize, or exclude seemingly vicious verses. We can read passages like this, not with political anxiety, but with hopeful tension, anticipating and participating in God's victory over sin. And I think Isaiah 11 has a part of the divine warrior armor of God in it. Verses 1-9 read, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse." And remember, we earlier saw that Joshua, son of Jehozadak, was called the branch from the stump of Jesse, not from Jesse, but he was called repeatedly the branch in Zechariah's vision. "And a branch from its roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him." Sounds like Jesus's sermon in Nazareth before he got forced off a cliff, or about to. "The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins." I think that's the armor of God. "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." And I included this at the end, this is the last slide, because it ties together so many of these different facets. The armor of God, the stump of Jesse and Zechariah's vision, how that applies to the high priest and how his name is the same as Jesus. The peaceable kingdom where predators still exist, but their function, their behavior has changed. In the very beginning, thorns and thistles grew up out of defense from us. We were supposed to be we were supposed to work until or serve and protect all the generations of creation, and we screwed it up. And so out of that screw up, thorns and thistles arise, prey and predator arise, and God, through Scripture, through Jesus, is trying to undo that. There will still be soldiers, there will still be predators, but they will be different, right? All of those things that became necessary because of sin, corruption, are beginning to go away through Christ. And Christ, and in the middle, with the breath of his lips, he shall kill the wicked. That was the alternative title for this session, because it's hard to think about that. Like, in the midst of these predators who are laying down with their prey, God, with the breath of his lips, shall kill the wicked. Like, it's hard. It's not easy. But I don't think that the Bible or Jesus promises us ease, but rather goodness, togetherness. Remember, the two things are that all things were created good, and they were meant to be together. And that is, I think that's the core of what the Bible is trying to get, to bring us together and to remind us that we are good. Predator, prey, soldier, saint. We have 9 minutes for discussion. I tried to warn y'all this is going to be a longer one. I hope you'll forgive me if we don't have much time for it. But do I have any questions, comments, sage advice? Yeah.
What struck me fresh is you could see everything that fueled the crusades. You could see bishops preaching.
Yeah.
Because with time, I think it's easy to, back in the day, we know much better now. What did they know? They wanted to
Mhm,
write at the
mhm.
time. What else we see all of that addressed?
So on,
Logan said at the end about the creation that God declared it good and that we're all supposed to be together. That's kind of what I see this part, the last part of that Isaiah scripture at the end is not just to remind them that creation is good and we are good. Well, basically to remind us that creation is good, that all of creation, and so for like pointing fingers or whatever at, oh, those people aren't good, or that country isn't good, or we're doing exactly the opposite of what it seems that this is trying to say.
I also mentioned the Israeli military because when I was in Palestine, I went to this protest in Berlin. I met a guy who was killed a couple of years ago. And I heard people that I was with, protesters, screaming at the Israeli military, baby killers. I always thought this was like mythic, like nobody really said that, right? I heard it. And that was one of those moments that struck me like, oh, it cuts both ways. Like we all have this other or others that we just, as long as I'm not like them, right? The publican and tax collector, as long as I'm not like them, I'm good, right? But I mean, that's the problem, right? We're all human. Our corruption is wrapped up in theirs, and I think, salvation is wrapped up in theirs. The bears and the lions and the adders are all going to be there.
I'm having a conversation with colleagues of mine, friends of mine, and we just happen to be from 7 different African countries. And so we genuinely exploring, can corruption in Africa even be, can you even begin to look at it? And how do you even begin to explore that on the basic community level? Especially because Christianity is just growing so rapidly. And so it's a fascinating conversation. I fly from here to DC, the same dialing code, and it's the same currency. I remember trying to drive from Cape Town to Cairo, but then the wars in Rwanda began, and then why can't that be in Africa as well? So all of this is just a very offering interesting insight into just how to maybe reframe the conversations afresh. At least for me, kind of interesting.
Yeah, like to know more about
But Logan, so I had sent you a question last week, and you were talking about the Jesus never met any Roman soldiers or foreign soldiers, and I was just asking you, so what's the significance of that, and what does that mean to us?
So Roman is like Judean. If you think it means one thing, you're going to be mistaken, right? So in 1,000 years, historians are reading books about us, right? Maybe about the American, right? There's going to be people who are like, oh, African American. Are they like, they're not quite American? Or I don't get it. That's what Judea was like. There were, zealously religious Judeans who were also, I'll call them Israelites. When I say Israelites, I intend to mean people who were aware of, connected to, and who aspired to keep going the story that we see in the canonical Bible. So there are Israelites, A lot of them were in Jerusalem, but there's also a lot scattered around Galilee, the Judean plains. So a Roman coming to Judea would just probably prefer to glom them all together. Yeah, one Judean, you've met one Judean, you've met them all, right? Not true. And Romans felt the same way. So when we say Roman soldiers, and I think I gave this brief talk about there's the legionaries, then there's the auxiliaries, and then there's the numeric masses. In Judea, the massive land, the only light-skinned legionaries you would have found were in Caesarea Maritima. Jesus never went there, ever. When it says soldiers in the Bible, it probably means these darker skinned Syrian recruits. And when I say Syrian, I mean like Roman Syria, which went which include I don't know how far east it went, but the Roman, or I'm sorry, Judea was a sub-province under Syria. Their governor was the governor the governor ruled out of Antioch, and Sebast was a big recruiting area. And then there was a cohort in Jerusalem, sometimes referred to as the temple police. They were auxiliaries. Now, a legionary would look at an auxiliary and be like, you're not a real Roman. Just like I would look at a pope and be like, you're not a real grunt. We do this, right? This is ultimately human, right? So what we mean when we say Roman soldiers is going to vary. We've heard it in this church. Chris talked about the Roman, the occupation in Rome. Technically, that occupation didn't exist until Jesus died. So the Gospels are telling a story about a time that is not like theirs. It's like Civil War. If someone were writing about Civil War and not letting you know that they're writing in the middle of the Civil War, and when the southern states did this and that and the other thing, well, they hadn't seceded yet. So there's some context that's really important to understand. That's why I say there was no occupation of Rome until this started getting written down. So if we want to get to something like Jesus' own historical, or whatever we might be able to know about the historical Jesus, it alters what we think of when we think of the military. Because once the pot started boiling over in 66 AD, that's when the shit hit the fan. And Paul was probably already dead. He stopped writing. The last letter we had was like in 59, 58. He and Peter might have been killed in Rome in the fires with Nero. But they're all writing tongue in cheek about a time that is very different from their own. So when like Mark or like Matthew and Luke or John refer to like this oppression and injustice, they feel it. It's real. But it was different with Jesus. So one of the soldiers in particular, the soldier of great faith, centurion of great faith, he was most likely, he appears in Matthew 8, Luke 7, and in John 4. In John 4, it's a royal official. In Greek, it's basilikos, and here's why. Judea was a feudal system. If there were like the sovereigns, kings and lords, well, kings, and then their lords or the knighthood are these wealthy, influential, powerful people who like rely on the sovereign for some things, but who have a lot of money and a lot of autonomy. That's what this guy was. That's why he's a royal official. He's close to Herod Antipas. He is in charge of about 100 men. And the writers of the New Testament were not soldiers or civilians. They say, oh, he's the commander of 100 men. That's what it's sergeant. And in the army, at least, sergeant is a bunch of different ranks. You say sergeant, I ask, well, what's the grade? 6, 5, 7, 8, 9. So that's what Hecaton Tarchus was. It's more accurate to say he's a royal official because he was within the royal court of Antipas. And within that royal court, if you had money, you're expected to equip, train, and command men. That makes him a commander of 100, but he's not a Roman. He's probably not Roman at all. But in a civilian trying to make sense of military culture, will say things that might make sense to a civilian, but are totally nonsense if you're doing your homework, I'll say. And we'll get into that next week, I'll have some examples of how some of this affects and influences a wider interpretation of, especially the New Testament, with what I call Captain Marvel, who makes Jesus Marvel. In Acts 16, Lydia is probably a military spouse, a widower or widow. The prisoner, the jailer of Philippi, is also probably a soldier. Philippi itself was a Roman veteran colony. It's a letter, when Saul writes to the Philippians, he's writing to like Fayetteville, North Carolina, Oceanside, California, and he knew it. He uses these imperial terms. And so there's all these things that begin to kind of show up when you think about things slightly differently, given the context that was in place at the time. And that's why I say, I think I said somewhere in there, like, not finally, it's not the only thing that connects them, it's just the latest thing I've found. What I've been able to give y'all is me doing research and getting excited about it, doing those graphics and making it maps and everything. And this is where my research is right now. And I'm finding more stuff constantly. That's why I ramble and go on and on. I have another entire presentation on war that I was going to give that I haven't given yet. But yeah, there's a lot there that if we look with clear eyes, or as clear eyes as we can, I think a lot more things begin to make sense and begin to connect. I'll close with this observation somebody made in an online community I'm in. Mostly pacifist. My sense is it's mostly pacifist leveling. And somebody said, you know, it's really hard for me to take like a really pacifist stance because the world as we know it is built upon predation, and you know, like animals have to eat other animals to stay alive. Like we can't take too hard of a pacifist line and say all violence is bad, but we haven't like come up with the tools to differentiate between good violence and bad violence. I liken it to like surgery, to use military metaphor. There's an important moral distinction between, say, a sniper who pulls the trigger and his own spotter who's just helping him. And we haven't been able to get at those fine moral distinctions. We want to, I've said it before, I'm sure, we avoid these passages. Influential, well-meaning, important, well-paid, educated men and women are like avoiding full swaths of the Bible because it gives them anxiety. I don't get to do that because violence is my bread and butter. For 6 years, I did it. And I want to understand what that means for me. I want to find meaning in this community we call the church, but I haven't. And a lot of other soldiers and vets I've met haven't. And they are invested in these minute moral distinctions that when we devote ourselves to looking closely, they begin to open up. And we begin to see things like the divine warrior and the armor of God, and how it's like, it's okay. I'll get into this next week, but one of the first things I learned in upgrade is dying is not the worst thing that can happen to you. It'll suck, don't get me wrong, but that's not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen is you're an asshole, you die, and you don't get a chance to not be an asshole. That's the worst thing that can happen. There are good deaths, there are bad deaths, and if dying is the worst thing that can happen, the worst fate you might meet is not that you were one of the residents of Jericho. It's not that you were one of the Canaanite tribes that met Israelites who kept miraculously winning over more powerful, numerous people. Like, I'm sorry, death sucks, that's true, but it's not the worst that can happen to you. And if that's one of your starting points, that alters, it has altered how I read the text. That the worst thing that can happen is not dying, it's something else. And if we can get to those moral distinctions, I think there's a lot of our faith that will make a lot more sense, and our scripture will make a lot more sense if we can set some of these anxieties aside for a moment and have difficult conversations about power, about corruption, about questions like, why can't I drive from Cape Town to China? I can drive from here to DC. Like, that's a good question. That's an important question. It's not easy. But these are the kind of questions that have influenced the Bible study. I appreciate you all for bearing with me, listening to me, or at least pretending to listen. I know Nancy's pretending.
Let's defend the line.
I'm going to end it. And next week, we'll have much more discussion than presentation. We're going to be having some resources like Captain Marvel. I'm going to have more handouts. And we'll have a little bit more of a round table. I'll be sitting down. I'm not going to be standing up. All right, everybody on Zoom, thank you for joining us. Oh, let me see if I can do that. Oh, maybe I can't. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm gonna end the meeting and end recording. I'll see you next time. See you, Jeremy.